humanist perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello again, and thanks for joining us today. My guest on our program today is Dr. Bill Warren. He's the director of the Center for New Testament Textual Studies. He's professor of New Testament and Greek at the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I have wanted for some time to talk with Dr. Warren ever since I read a very lengthy and interesting article in the Times-Picayune, and want to tell you what that read. Here's the introduction to this article. It says, in the beginning was the Word, but when the Bible was hand-copied, words changed. Local scholars are creating a tool to study those changes. Bill Warren, head of the Center for New Testament Textual Studies, holds a piece of papyrus that contains part of the Gospel of John. This was a picture of Bill in the newspaper. Working in a cluster of offices above the Lifeway bookstore in Gentilly, Bible scholars are buried in a 20-year project to codify the thousands of changes, verse by verse, word by word, even letter by letter, that crept into the early New Testament during hundreds of years of laborious hand copying. Now, my first question, Bill, is what was it that inspired or motivated you folks out at the seminary to begin this long-term, probably very labor-intensive and expensive project? What was it how did you make the decision to do that?
Actually, the study of any ancient book requires, if you have more than one copy, for the copies to be examined and double-check where the changes are to figure out what's the most likely original text, or at least the earliest attainable text. And so as a Christian attached to a foundational document, the Bible, and specifically focus on the New Testament, one of the starting points for any study of the Bible is to have a solid text. And so you can't really get a solid text when you have 5,800 some odd Greek manuscripts, 8,000 plus Latin manuscripts, and many, many more other types of manuscripts in other languages, unless you actually go through and study all of these to figure out, okay, now where did in the hand copying some of the scribes maybe misspell something, or maybe they skip a line, or maybe they even add a clarifying remark in to where it's actually commentary added into the text. And the only way to sort that out is to actually engage in long-term projects like this, to where we put the data in front of people, and that way they can start making their own study of it to figure out why they think different changes came about.
When you're talking about these thousands of manuscripts, you're talking about manuscripts related to Jesus and His life and the resurrection.
These are copies of the New Testament.
New Testament manuscripts. But was your purpose was to to justify or to authenticate what is presently called the New Testament?
I think that would be part of it. It actually happens, as I said, with any ancient document. My field is New Testament, and I have obviously an internal desire to study that document. But it actually happens with any ancient Greek writer, Roman writer, or writer from any setting.
Yes.
And so we have to, this is an international type field, and we work with people in Germany, we work with people in the United Kingdom on some of our projects. This just happens to be a project that we ourselves initiated, and so we're carrying it out here in New Orleans.
All right. Now that I've questioned you about your motives, tell us about what you're doing.
Okay. Okay. We use documents, and those documents end up having to be sorted through, but they become the foundations for modern translations of the Bible, New Testament in this case. And so we tend to translate from one of the Greek New Testaments like this, and this is what we call a critical edition. And so these editions actually have notes from all the manuscripts, and you have to weigh out the readings. But this is what translations are made from. So when we're reading, we're already reading a translation.
From the Greek.
From the Greek.
Now, were all those thousands of documents that you were referring to, were they all written in Greek, or were there other languages?
We have about 5,800 in Greek of just the New Testament, different parts.
But there are others in other languages?
And then in other languages, we have Syriac, we have Coptic from Egypt, we have Latin, we have Armenian, Georgian, Slavic.
And you have gone into those documents. How
Our specialty is not in the other languages as much, but we do some work with the Latin and some work with the Coptic.
All right. I was just wondering how many languages were required for this project of yours.
Well, long term, the projects like this actually have to incorporate specialists from universities and other settings in every one of these languages.
Okay, but presently you have a number of people working on this project.
Yes, there are 10 of us that work at the center. And we end up, we actually have multiple projects, but for quite a while, everybody was focused just on this database project.
All right. But primarily you're looking at all of the ancient Greek documents, and you yourself are teaching Greek out at the seminary. Is that your background? You have a Greek background?
Well, I wish I did. I enjoy learning languages. Reading languages is not that difficult in several languages. Speaking, thinking in another language, actually the best fluency I have outside of English would be in Spanish. I go teach every year in Latin America and Colombia, Cuba. We lived in Colombia for a number of years. And my Greek is not at that level for modern Greek. But reading the New Testament is not a problem. I've studied it now for 35 years.
Okay, now I distracted you from telling us, what your whole group is doing, what you have accomplished up to this point, and what's left to be done.
Yeah. When we have these Greek New Testaments, somebody has to compile all this information, and we don't have this in our English Bibles, unfortunately, only a few snippets of it. But all of this information down below is textual information showing what different manuscripts read. But the thing is, in our printed text, that's probably at best about 1/20th of the real information. So this is condensed here. And this is the fullest apparatus that people use on a regular basis until, at least, we came out with ours. Our apparatus actually will show every little detail. It will show spelling differences. It'll show variants never mentioned here. And so just for the New Testament, right now we're at about 17,000 pages of data.
When you said your apparatus, are we talking about computers?
We do have this put on a computer, and that's actually the wonderful thing about the time period we're living in. What we're doing would have hardly been feasible in earlier times because we can compile this data much more readily. We can make it searchable in ways that never were searchable before. And so this just gives tools to anyone wanting to study the text. It doesn't have to be, it's not specifically a Christian tool per se. It's a tool for anyone studying the text.
Now, when you, I don't know whether you're working back from the contemporary Bible to see how verses changed, or whether you're working up from the earliest possible documents. What is your approach?
Yeah, this approach is actually coming from the earlier ones forward. And so we try to make sure that we get some of the earliest manuscripts in the first 1,000 years especially, and that we get that information in. And then we add some from a later time. Of course, once the printing press comes into play, then you're in a different time period, because you can print as many copies exactly alike as you want. Yes. At least after they perfect it a little bit.
Yes, so, but in the early
hand copying a text, you and I would do the same thing. If we're going to hand copy a text that's 20 or 30 pages long, like one of the Gospels, we're going to make mistakes in the copying. That's just the human factor.
But you searched for the most legitimate of the documents that you could find, and the earliest ones.
That's right.
And then are you following them through the translations and the whatever changes may have? You're following a document through up to the contemporary Bible?
Okay, we actually have another project that builds on this, and that's why we've got a 20-year time frame. First, we had to get this project with the Greek text in place, and it's really a scholar's project. Because if you don't use Greek, this project, to be up front, is not that much of a help to you, because it requires Greek, because the manuscripts are in Greek. Yes. And so, but now we're building another set off of this that actually does exactly what you're saying. You're on the same wavelength we were on that. We're starting from the English translations. Yes. And we're showing, okay, how do these differences help us to understand this English text? Because as we know, when you make a translation, you can't show all of these variants that we may not think were original, but they still may be very important to us. Because how did they understand it in the 2nd century? Okay. And sometimes we have these variants to where we can date them to the 2nd century. And so all of a sudden you have commentary from the 2nd century that shows other ways of understanding the text, trying to clarify it normally. And you
could identify the authors of some of these manuscripts?
Well, I wish we could. Only a few of them have dates, and so we have to date them based on paleography. Sometimes there's some other dating systems we're able to use. Paleography would be the handwriting styles from different time periods. They shift. So we can get a fairly accurate dating. Plus or minus 50 years is fairly reasonable to expect on the dating of a document. And then we do get a few that actually put the name of the writer, right. But those are exceptions.
Now, are you finding, or have you found, that these old manuscripts are reasonably represented in the contemporary English language Bible, that even though there were translation changes and other copying changes and maybe whatever, you still find that they are relatively supportive of what's in the contemporary Bible?
Yeah, the more recent translations normally are made from the Greek text as we now print it. And we don't print the same Greek text that we used to, in the sense there are some fine points. Now we're talking about, when you think of the entire text, probably 2-3% of the text where we still have some question, and there's probably about 1% where we still have some pretty serious questions over what exactly is the right reading. But the modern Greek text, like I showed you, this is where we actually print what we believe is the right reading to use from the earliest text that we can get back to on this document. And the modern English translations, by and large now, are made from that text. Now, what that means de facto is some of the earlier English translations were made from printed Greek New Testaments that didn't have the same foundation that we would have today. Now, for example, King James.
All right.
We just celebrated a wonderful 400th anniversary of this monumental work that had such a huge impact, not just in religious settings, not just with Christianity, but even with literature itself. But when they created their New Testament text, they translated their earliest manuscripts only went back to around the 11th century. Now we can go back to the 2nd century.
All right. Now, I don't pretend to be a student of the Bible, Old or New Testament, but what did King James do? He changed the Bible that was being used at that time. Did he make it more authentic or less so?
The story of the King James Bible is actually quite fascinating. King James was raised and with tutors, and they were Presbyterian tutors, very Calvinistic, and he reacted strongly against it. And so he didn't do anything on the translation, he authorized it to be made. And actually scholars from Oxford and Cambridge and Westminster made the translation. Now where they did a real positive item for us is they actually had groups working on it to where you don't just get one person's interpretation. Because we know no group is on a good foundation. If only their group had input into a translation, they're going to put their own theology into it. Okay. And that's not a healthy translation of any document. And so he put us on a, not him, but the group in charge of it, put us on a good road on using a group. Their problem was the Greek New Testament they used is one that we actually have a lot more information for. Their basic foundation was 6 Greek manuscripts, and now we have 5,800. So obviously when people compare a King James to modern translations, they will see some differences because we can clarify the text much more nowadays.
All right. Now, since you indicated that most of these were not, you don't know the author nor the date, have you established that any of these manuscripts came from at the same time of that Jesus was alive?
Yeah, we sure wish we had some. No. And of course, Jesus didn't write any of the New Testament.
Well, most people didn't write anything at that time. It was almost all
the literacy
of this.
rates were much lower than we could even imagine for the larger Roman Empire.
What then, and you know, all I know very little, but I know there are the Gospels, presumably telling the story of Jesus' life and crucifixion. What's the earliest documentation you have in relating to those things? Okay.
We actually have one papyrus fragment. That's what the earliest texts were written on. It was a piece of papyrus like this. They would make it not that far different from our page size. You can sort of see a page size here, and I don't know how it will show up, but these are photographs, and you can see more or less the size. This is a 3rd century document of Paul's epistles. And so we have one small fragment, not nearly this size, of the Gospel of John that seems to come from the first half of the 2nd century. Now that's our earliest.
Now, when you say Paul's epistles, and we're talking about Greek, was that their language?
That was the dominant language in the Roman Empire at the time. And for Paul, it was probably his first language. But he also knew Hebrew, probably Aramaic as well.
All right.
Being multilingual was actually the norm, not the exception.
All right. So the documents that you have post-date the lifetime of Christ, of Jesus.
Yes, definitely.
Which leads many skeptics to say these came from word of mouth. From in fact, I had an interesting little thing here. It says others defend a rigid biblical liberalism, adamantly wishing away a century and a half of scholarship that has clearly shown that the canonized Gospels were written decades after Jesus' ministry and are copies of stories told by those with fallible memory. Now, how do you react?
Sounds like Bart Ehrman.
Well, but, you know, and I'll have to say...
A friend of mine, actually. I don't agree with him.
As you well know, I'm representing secular humanists.
Right.
And so we're not religious people. And what they're saying here carries a lot of weight with us, that it's written, they're copies of stories told by those with fallible memories. Does that not disturb you?
No, I think we have a reliable enough historical reconstruction to where what we do know is the early church as it begins is primarily Jewish in its first at least 20 years until Paul starts causing more and more non-Jews to be brought in.
Yes.
And we know in the Jewish setting, this recitation, memorization, was a pretty standard facet of life with the Jewish history. But they are passing along primarily in oral form at that point. We do feel like as you're starting to bring in these non-Jews especially, you get more and more need for written items for these new converts. Those are not yet our Gospels. And so we don't feel like our Gospels, let's say Jesus' accepted date is he's crucified in 30 A.D. And so our Gospel is probably the earliest one is the Gospel of Mark, and it's written in the late 60s, 65 to 70.
All right.
And so Matthew and Luke would be in the 70s, perhaps even early 80s, John very likely in the 90s. And so we are decades away. That part is not our dispute. But we do think that you still had reliable witnesses along the way. And you sort of see that by way of how Matthew and Luke use Mark. That's one of their primary sources. Well, we do feel like Mark is a pretty reliable source because of how the traditions are built in behind it. How do they tell stories? Do they have differences of opinion among the Gospels? Yes, we think that's actually part of the richness. There's no collaboration between them to where they say, now let's all tell the story exactly alike. They actually don't worry about that. And they tell the story in different ways, figuring, well, you know, that'll be the richness, and the church decides. There's an effort in the 2nd century to make it just one gospel. And the church says, no, we're just going to keep them, and the differences we deal with.
Now, you do understand that there is a large body of opinion that the whole Jesus story is not historic. And this is a current issue of the American Atheist magazine. And this is a book, a new book by Robert Price, The Christ Myth Theory, which he says is, you know, simply a theory, that there's no evidence for it. Now, did you find in all of your research that there was any documentation in the form of written material or marble inscriptions or anything at the time that Christ was preaching and resurrected? Did you find any documentation for that?
Okay. What we do have on his existence is, of course, we have even Roman historians mentioning it. And so,
writing at the time of his life, or was this afterward also? History
is almost always written afterwards, but they would have had no vested interest for even mentioning it. And yet we have Tacitus and Suetonius even saying that Jesus is crucified under Pontius Pilate. And so they definitely have an acceptance level on the history that they're writing.
But from what I have read, there was nothing at that time in any of whatever they had there, journals or whatever, however they wrote things and had court cases and they crucified people, that there's nothing specifically that said that this man was a person who was crucified or that he was resurrected. From what I understand, it is all word of mouth, you know, to another generation. Is that not correct?
I think you've got a great half-truth going.
All right.
I do think we're being anachronistic on how life was in that time period. And so we normally don't have much contemporary data on any historical figure. Almost always they write up their histories after the fact.
Well, isn't there historic evidence for Pontius Pilate, for instance? Isn't there historic evidence?
We have no in his lifetime evidence.
Well, okay.
And so, but we have plenty of Roman history that does mention him.
All right. Well, you know, and I'm not discrediting any of your work. I'm just saying.
But that's how ancient history took place.
And I'm reading, and I'm sorry I didn't indicate where I got this from, but this is a quotation. And he says, Jesus was one of at least a dozen self-styled messiahs during the 50 years leading up to the War of 66-73 CE, who raised an army of less than 150 followers. He's talking about a dozen messiahs. An army of less than 150 followers, proclaimed independence and was promptly arrested and crucified without causing as much as a ripple in the Pax Romana. Jesus was a nobody who did nothing. Now, this is what this man is saying. If Paul had made him the figurehead of his new Gentile religion, the name of Jesus would, if Paul had not done that, the name of Jesus would be as unknown to Christians as it was to the first century commentators. Now, the people who write that are not, they're not out there to destroy Christianity.
Right.
They're students of the past, as you are. And are you willing to accept some question about the legitimacy of a man called Jesus Christ who lived and was resurrected? The
historical evidence for the existence of Jesus is so overwhelming that I would actually say that's almost just a foolish item to even keep pursuing. Obviously, there was a person named Jesus who lived in the first century, and he had a huge impact, and something totally amazing must have happened to account for the fact that without a military movement, which is what the other pretenders, messianic pretenders, did try to start, he ends up with his entire legacy going forward in just amazing ways. And so you have to account for that somehow. Now, I understand some will not agree with how we as Christians account for it with the resurrection. I understand that. But I still think there has to be some accounting, because we don't even think about the names of those other messianic pretenders nowadays.
We don't. Well,
they just passed from history.
You may have found the names, but no one else.
We have several of the names.
Yeah, but most people have never heard of them.
They just passed from history. There were no followers.
Exactly.
Normally, if they did try to keep it going, they had family members pick up the slack and become the leaders. But with Jesus, there are no family member leaders. It stays focused on Him.
I regret that our time has run out.
We may have to follow up with it.
There is much more that you could tell us, and I really admire what you're doing. And hope
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
I'd like to bring you back again another time. And I want to thank you folks for watching our show, and hope you will be with us again.